From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now, or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. We're back. Set the scene. The ship is docked. It is pretty late. There's been a birthday party on the vessel earlier that evening, and there are about 12 people on board. The ship is prepping to head out to confront the French authorities conducting this nuclear test. And right before the stroke of midnight, an explosion rocks the vessel. Boom! Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, as you can imagine, chaos ensues. The crew scrambles to escape. It's not the time to go into the engine room and see what made that noise. They want to stay alive, right?
And that is where the first explosion originates, is in or near the engine room.
Right, exactly. And so everybody is getting off the vessel, and they wait for just a second. There's one guy, a Portuguese photographer named Fernando Pereira. And after this explosion, after he gets away, he looks around and he thinks, oh, snap, I need to get all of my stuff, my equipment. We're documenting this. I'm a photographer. I need my camera and my film. And so he returns to the ship to grab his gear right after that first explosion. And he is on board when the second explosion occurs.
Yeah, and he's killed by that second explosion, and his death was the impetus for the initial investigation into this whole situation, one of the largest in the history of New Zealand. And two French agents, Captain Dominique Prière and Commander Alain Maffar, are identified by a local neighborhood watch.
Right?
Yeah. Like what? There's like neighborhood watches at sea. I mean, that's very unusual.
Well, there's a lot of weirdness that's going on behind the scenes that we later find out. But there were numerous French agents inside Auckland at the time, specifically focusing on this ship, this vessel, on the Rainbow Warrior and on Greenpeace's activities. And it's crazy. We can maybe talk about it a little more. Several of the either teams of agents and or just individual agents were not so good at being spies, I guess, at like covering their tracks and at being inconspicuous.
Yeah, and not to play backseat espionage, right?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, dude.
Yeah. Do you know?
It's just they were much more easily identified by groups like that Neighborhood Watch than you would expect.
How amazing to be the people of the Neighborhood Watch, though. They must have been like pretty impressed with themselves, right?
I think this guy might be a spy.
That is a big one. I mean, if I was on a Neighborhood Watch and I, landed this whale, I would feel pretty good about myself and feel like Neighborhood Watches far and wide should take note.
Yeah,
no, he's not a spy. Why would he be a spy in Auckland? No, he's not a spy. What accent is this?
I don't know. It's kind of Cockney, a little bit of Mary Poppins.
yeah. It feels like a spy is trying out some accents. Watch out for bits. That's what I remember from Flight of the Conchords. But also, if you're that Neighborhood Watch person, and we don't have the specific name of the individual or individuals in the Neighborhood Watch who were instrumental in these arrests, but if I were that person, I'd make certain that comes up in some way in every neighborhood meeting, every HOA meeting. Hey, New Zealand Ben, you're not mowing your lawn on time. And I'm like, oh, sorry, I was busy saving the neighborhood. I don't know where your priorities are, Gladys, but if I'm catching spies, I can't do it while I'm mowing my lawn. I would be insufferable.
For me, it would be like, raise your hand. Hi, Matt Frederick. Caught those spies that one time. Neighborhood watch.
Yes, exactly. So, good on them, honestly. But this becomes very complicated very quickly because, as you said, Matt, there is a lot of stuff going on in the background. It's not just these two guys. And at this point, Carbon hasn't been made yet. She's still Frederique. And there's a problem because there's public outcry, right? New Zealand is saying this is a terrorist attack. France is an ally of New Zealand. And at first they're like, yeah, it's crazy. What happened? The world is a nutso place, you guys. And then they said, of course, we aren't involved. Like all these other nations, we condemn this terrorist act. The French embassy in Wellington stated explicitly, the French government does not deal with its opponents in such ways. What is interesting about this, it is that it was completely false. It was completely false. The people issuing the statement probably knew it was completely false. Those two agents, when they got arrested, it came out that they had Swiss passports. When they got made and their identities got burned, it's an instant smoking gun for France, right? You can see these guys' reps. You can see their history. It turns out that they were not who they said they were. Carbon / Frederique has successfully escaped internationally to Israel just before the attack occurred. And there are a lot of other people, later researchers would learn, from these two diving teams that also got away. And some of it really is action movie stuff. Like one of the teams that transported the explosives, they did so on a yacht, and then they did get detained in Australia, but because of Australian law, they couldn't be held. And so they went back on their yacht and they went off, and then they hitched a ride with a French submarine, and the French submarine sank the yacht. This was very scorched earth. They really did not want to leave traces, but their attempts at a cover-up were, as you said, Matt, quite unsuccessful. It was soon very, very clear to the government of New Zealand that their so-called ally France had clearly and purposefully and successfully conspired to blow the Rainbow Warrior out of the water. Consequences be damned. And this is such an escalation from just trying to bribe people with $5,000.
Or even sending a bunch of heavies on board to beat up the people who were on that ship that are trying to protest. Even we can talk about the intentions later, but even if the intentions of the government were simply to scuttle the ship or to sink the ship and not harm anybody, that's still an act of terrorism. At least now it would be considered that.
Yeah, very much so. And, we have to keep in mind that some of these conversations aren't making it to the public sphere just yet. There's a moment where New Zealand sends over like physical evidence to France. Like, we know what you did.
So
yeah, we know what you did. Yeah, what's good? And this became a political scandal as word got out. So you see a domino effect of French politicians leaving office. The Minister of Defense at the time, Charles Hernu, he resigns. And then the head of the DGSE is a guy named Admiral Pierre Lacoste. He is fired. And, if you're familiar with a lot of the upper reaches of Western politics, usually what happens when someone gets fired is they say they're retiring to spend time with their family or something innocuous like that.
That's the out they give you, I suppose. No one wants to utterly, well, there are times where they do want to utterly run you up the flagpole. But this was not one of those situations, I suppose.
Sometimes you have to take a break to pursue painting if you're, an ex-president.
So this is the problem, though. They still have these two agents on the hook. The captains that you mentioned earlier, Noel, they have been arrested, and eventually they get released to French custody, and then they go free. But the reality of what happened behind the scenes, how France got those guys back and how they got away with this attack it's the dirty part of international affairs. These guys were both sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. They pled guilty to manslaughter. And then France went back to New Zealand and threatened to wage economic warfare. They said, look, we're going to shut your stuff down. You will not be able to export anything to Europe unless you give us our operatives back. And this was not an empty threat. It would have absolutely crippled New Zealand's economy. It was highly independent on agricultural exports to the United Kingdom. And this kind of like sending in the economic heavies, to borrow your earlier phrase, Matt, this stuff happens way more often than people would like to think. And
it's like that book, the Economic Hitman.
Yes, yeah, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. No kidding, that's a great read. On September 22nd, 1985, the prime minister at the time finally admits the bombing has been a French plot. And he says, the truth is cruel. There was an operation, there was a resulting cover-up, and they went on to say agents of the French Secret Service sank this boat. They were acting on orders. The elephant in the room, the other shoe waiting to drop. Whose orders exactly? And that's a question that remains officially unanswered in the modern day. So in a way, the conspiracy is still afoot. The Western world, in New Zealand's opinion, really dropped the ball. They didn't condemn France at all. And this had serious ramifications for the way New Zealand saw other European countries, the way it saw the U.S. especially. And in 1987, France ponied up compensation for the Portuguese photographer's family. And then they also gave Greenpeace the equivalent of $8.16 million.
Got to save a few trees or whatever it is they're saving. After a little time goes by, details of the actual conspiracy start to trickle out. And here's what we know. There were 2 teams involved in transporting and placing those bombs. According to some confessions obtained later, these confessions were from the operatives involved. The plan was never to injure anybody. With the boat docked, they thought they could just kind of render the ship inert or at least just wreck it. So it couldn't be used, but not actually risk losing any lives. But they goofed, didn't they? The dive team placed the explosives as planned, but the explosions were larger than they had predicted, which to me, doesn't that mean that there was too much explosive? Or is it just one of these things like we're talking about with circumstances that could cause, variables that could cause the explosions to differ?
There's quite a few things going on here. First thing you need to know is that the original plan was to place the explosives on the opposite side of the hull, the other side of the ship, but there was another boat kind of near there, and there seemed to be people on that boat, and they didn't want to, at least according to the confessions here, they didn't want to harm anyone on that boat, so they decided just in the moment to switch sides on the boat. And again, the engine room is right there. The whole, who knows what factors led to the size of that explosion, but what we do know is that the explosion came from the outside of the ship, and the damage that you can see to the hull from that explosion that then goes in and moves into the boat is big.
Yeah, and there's shrapnel flying. This is the thing. I think we were talking about this a little bit off air. This is one of the things that gets me. How are you going to so extensively plan an operation like this and, as one of the operatives later said, not test it? They didn't test it on a boat. And Matt, you raised an interesting point about how we should regard France's nuclear experiments, right? Those are the biggest explosives. And I can't quite remember how you put it.
Oh, yeah. The French military has the time and funds to test all of those nukes, however many at that time in 1985, however many they had tested at that point since the 60s. They had the time and all that money, the millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to do that, but they didn't have enough time and money to test one probably small. What do you think? Maybe C4? I don't know. I doubt it was dynamite or anything like that. It had to be some kind of plastic explosive. But
yeah, but they didn't test that part. Everything else, they had these identities, they had personas, they had transported explosives through international waters. They never tested it out. And that's something that happens with a lot of government conspiracies. Something goes wrong. They messed up. And, this again could be for any number of factors that change on the ground.
But that first explosion wasn't even the major issue. Even though it was larger than they expected, and it did sink the ship faster than the timeline, than they expected, that isn't what killed anybody. Like we said, it was that second explosion.
Right. And you can even see the logic. The 4-minute interval between explosions could be baked in to allow people to hear that first explosion, maybe even almost as a warning, and then abandon ship. But they didn't bet on someone, whatever their calculations were, they didn't bet on someone coming back so soon after that first explosion. And there's a really interesting interview out of TV New Zealand that was later aired on Democracy Now!, I think, where you can hear firsthand from one of the operatives about what went down. It was 30 years after the fact. But before we get to that guy, let's talk just a little bit about the continuing cover-up. So here's the thing. Other than the 2 men who were briefly arrested, no one ended up facing criminal charges for this act. Nobody, other than those 2 guys, and they eventually were let go. In 2005, the French newspaper of note, Le Monde, released a report from 1986 where the former head of DGSE said that it had been signed off by the president, Mitterrand. He had explicitly said, yeah, okay, that makes sense, blow it up. And that's
intense.
Yeah.
Executive orders.
Right. And so, when this admiral comes forward, he also gives the newspaper interviews about this situation. And he said, personally, this weighs on my conscience. We were not trying to kill people. But as history has proven pretty often, prosecuting a president is a difficult endeavor. There's a reason that the U.S. has that law about invading The Hague.
Yeah, it's very true. I want to jump to this individual we're talking about, the operative that confessed. This is the guy that led operations on the ground or in the water in this case. He's the person in charge of the whole thing. And he is the one that physically placed, or at least he says he's the one who physically placed the explosives onto the ship. And it's intense that he's the one who came forward to confess all of this and tell the world. And specifically to speak to the daughter of the photographer who was killed.
Yeah. Jean-Luc Kister. And it's a pretty in-depth interview. He answers questions that would naturally occur, like, why did you have a crisis of conscience 30 years after the fact, right? And his answer is something that I think a lot of people in the audience could understand today. If not agree with, you can understand where he's coming from. He said, look, this wasn't my only operation. I was active for a while. I was doing a lot of stuff, and I couldn't come forward because it could compromise those things. And then also, I'm first and foremost, I was a soldier. So I had to carry out orders. If you are a soldier, in his explanation, then you are mandated to do what you're told, even if you have questions or concerns, whether they are operational or ethical. So he heavily implies his hands were tied. He apologizes. And like you said, Matt, he requests the opportunity to speak with Pereira's daughter and apologize in person, and she declines it. And so now, with no real official consequences, the government of France has paid compensation. They've made apologies to New Zealand over the years a couple of different times, and the relationship between France and New Zealand seems to have normalized over the intervening years. But as we record today, don't be fooled. There's still calls for prosecution echoing in the halls of Greenpeace, echoing in the halls of New Zealand to the modern day. And this is where our story for now pauses. And we have to ask, at the risk of sounding cynical, Matt, Noel, I feel like the three of us in particular just sort of assume stuff like this is happening possibly now, right? Yeah. And we just don't hear about it.
Yeah, maybe not with, sexy names like Rainbow Warrior, but certainly this doesn't seem like too much of a stretch now.
Yeah, I mean, it does make me wonder about the powerful forces that go up against environmental activists of any kind. But it's weird because it feels like it, as we said before, these groups seem more like an annoyance to me for a big superpower like that than a real threat. Unless these forces really do put more weight into kind of what we were talking about before, the heart. If they're worried about heart more than some of the other powers, just from a PR, from a hearts and minds standpoint of the voters in their country and or the other voting countries in NATO and some of these other, the UN and these things, I could see them wanting to stop those kind of annoyances or the things that make them look bad.
Well, but it makes me think of a movie. Britt Marling is like an actor, writer, director, and she made a couple cool films. One's called Another Earth. It's like a science fiction thing. And then she made one called The East that's about a environmental terrorist group that is executing these covert attacks on major polluting corporations. And I'm not saying that's what you should do and that's the only way to get it done, but to elevate your cause from annoyance to absolute nemesis, or to go toe to toe with these companies, you either, like you said, Matt, have to really have an effective way of changing the hearts and minds of people that really matter, or you gotta just burn it all down. And that's not particularly productive either. And then it makes you kind of just as bad as the people you're fighting. But I understand the frustration when it comes to like, how do I take a stand against these giant corporations when it feels like doing it the right way often falls on deaf ears and is sort of easily brushed to the side.
Sure. Yeah. Because I mean, the fact of the matter is that it's very difficult for someone to take on entities like this in court, the expenses alone. And I think we have similar questions, because why would the French government not just arrest these people when they cross into the exclusion zone? And what consequences should there be for the people who were involved? And it's a question that hasn't been answered to the satisfaction of a lot of people. Obviously, we believe that there are more operations like this that have yet to be exposed. There may be some going on while we're recording. And this is where we pass the heart ring to you. What do you think? Why did France do this? What was their ultimate goal? What did they expect would happen? What other operations like this do you believe have occurred in the modern day? And when do you think the public will learn about them, if ever?